So, good afternoon, everyone. After the interesting words of Professor Rubens, I would like to introduce the speaker of today, Marcus Klaus. Just briefly sketching where he comes from. He's born in Germany and studied veterinary medicine at the Ludwig Maximilians Universität in Munich. You can see that was down in 1998 to 1997. I know this was not the time with his biggest passion, because already, I think from very young, the passion was about wild animals. So already while studying, he tried to get around, like to this park in South Africa, but also went to United States, different zoos in Germany, to get the hang of learning different species. And started to get interested in comparative nutrition, which is still the field where Marcus is most active in. After his studies, he got a grant from the DAAD scholarship in Germany to go to the UK, to the well-known Institute of the Zoo of London. That's where he studied Master in Wild Animal Health. And after that, he returned back to Germany, but in the meantime, he started publishing. I think this must have been one of the earliest that I found, together with Ellen Dierenfeld. I'm very proud to say that both Marcus and Ellen are now visiting professors at my group, very well known in the meantime in comparative nutrition and zoo nutrition. So this was one of the first on susceptibility of yak to copper deficiency, but that's just the start of a long series of publications. I don't know the exact number, but it's far above 300 in the meantime, with a decent age factor, so meaning that a lot of his research is picked up internationally. So when talking about his professional career, don't want you to read through all of this, but this he started as a research assistant at the Institute of Zoo and Wildlife Research in Berlin. And maybe an important thing is the director at that time was Professor Hofmann. Professor Hofmann, for people that are studying comparative nutrition, is like one of the key figures, because he is one as a very important paper or set of papers describing the difference between browsing animals, grazing animals, which is still published after being published in the 70s, still often referred to as one of the key papers, with, in the meantime, some comments left and right, but still one of the building blocks of the present comparative nutrition. So after that, he went to Munich again, where he studied, where he also was a research assistant. I know that who was part doing studies on the BSE. We had a few years before the severe BSE crisis in Europe. I know that, if I'm right, was not the real passion. The real passion was the comparative digestive physiology and nutrition, which was like a second job on the side. Then he became senior research associate in Zurich, where he was invited by Professor Jean-Michel Hatt to take this position. And that's where he is at the moment, but in the meantime, he grew into a professor position there, where he still is, and since 2008, with a small interruption, he has been also visiting professor at my department, and we've been collaborating for a long time in the meantime. When we look also on the specializing, you can see the track, a lot of things starting with the dissertation thesis in 2000, obtaining a certified veterinary specialist. I think in German it's Fachtierarzt, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Already in animal nutrition and dietetics, but then 1 year later also became a diplomat of the European College of Veterinary and Comparative Nutrition. That should be, the picture is in front, I'm sorry. 1 year later again, did the habilitation. This is not something we know as much, but this, let's say, PhD plus, I could call it. And then even 1 year later, the Venia Legendi, which is also connected to kind of prolongation on the PhD, allowing you to teach, etc., which he did at the Vet Swiss faculty in Zurich. So you see a quite substantial track record, not only in publications, but also in gathering different things. Now, I want to go back a little bit further in time now, because if you would look on Web of Science and you type the name of Klaus M., you might end up with this type of output. And the reason why I show this, you could say, oh, this is not about animal nutrition. This is about Cleopatra and about Roman emperors, etc. And Klaus M. is actually Professor Manfred Klaus. So actually he also has a quite famous father, which is one of the very renowned people on epigraphics. He has his own epigraphic database with, you see there, more than 800,000 sets of data collected. And why do I show this? There's very little link between, you could say, between this one, let's say, Latin carved in stone, and animal nutrition or comparative nutrition. But I think this is maybe where Marcus Klaus got the feeling for building very strong databases and having the opportunity to dig into the history of published data, sometimes very old data. I know you've been looking into published data of 16th or 17th century on elephants, bringing that back to life, as to speak, to make new science about. So the apple didn't fall far from the tree anyhow. Now, so raised with history and with databases, then of course you can think like, okay, maybe it's not such a big step from history to evolution. Evolution is one of the passions of Marcus, of involving evolutionary principles in comparative nutrition. This is one of the papers he did already a few years ago on dinosaurs, the sauropod gigantism, which is actually, this is a very nice read, and maybe even more some of the other dinosaur papers that Marcus has published with colleagues, showing the interest of really going far back in history. The other thing that I could say about this is Marcus is not only a very good nutritionist, he also is very good in anatomy and digestive anatomy, but even studying skeletons. A lot of papers on how the teeth are abrased by certain diets and how that translates into evolutionary principles, evolutionary outcomes. So maybe just on the side, because he's interested in paleontology, you could say, oh, this is another book about paleontology, but actually Marcus is also a novel writer. And he might be a bit embarrassed that I say so, but this is a good read. So if you can get hold of this book, it's not published in a lot of numbers, but I'm sure you can get it somewhere. A very interesting book, of course, about a scientist. I don't think it's autobiographic, maybe small parts, because it's about a woman. But just to mention. Some other things, I just picked some publications. I know Marcus will think these are not my most important publications, but just showing what the interesting approaches are. This is about dietary evolution, taking the panda as an example. Panda, which is actually by origin a carnivore, but we all know pandas eat bamboo, and all the approaches of is it still a carnivore, is it a herbivore, or what are the discussions there. So you get easily into science, evolution, but also philosophy. And this is indeed why I think that Marcus is really fits into this lecture. Another one that I would like to show is the historical development of zoo elephant survivorship. Marcus Klaus is also very much involved in the zoo community, especially in Europe, but actually around the world. So it's not just about the so-called high science, it's also about getting practical solutions for peoples in zoos for the conservation of animals. And this is one of the examples where it's looked at like, how are we dealing with elephants in zoos throughout the years, throughout the decades that we are keeping those elephants in zoos. And You might know or might not know that there's been quite some debates, especially in the UK, but around the world, on whether elephants should still be kept in zoos. And this is also, let's say, a debate that Marcus is not fearing and would like to get into. Another one, because I think it's also typical for the work he's doing, he often says to students, and recently Marcus was also giving a lecture to the students at our faculty, saying like, everybody wants to do hands-on research with zoo animals, but sometimes you just can, or with animals as such, sometimes you can have so many interesting data that you can filter from already published things, that you can get new insights from that. And this is also an example of that. So no news from old drawings, stomach anatomy in murrered rodents in relation to body size and ecology. If you're interested in anatomy, please look at that paper, because it has a very nice overview of all the mouse-like creatures and the very interesting stomachs those animals have. I was actually not aware of that. So although it says no news, I think there's news in there. Completely else, and we are starting now with a joint PhD student working on proboscis monkey, this nice creature there with the funny nose. Gastrointestinal morphology and ontogeny on foregut fermenting primates. He and his Japanese colleague Ike Matsuda were the first to demonstrate that there are primate species that are fermenting and actually ruminating, just like a cow. And I think this is the very interesting discoveries. You can say it's a very isolated thing, but it means that there's people can have a complete broader view on what primate nutrition actually is. So when I type, I didn't find a lot of picture of Marcus. I found this one on the internet, but it says a lot. You will soon see that he's a very good lecturer, but he likes graphs, and he's very good at explaining graphs. Graphs can be very boring, but you will see when he shows data, they come to life. And this is also something, a gift. Maybe a little bit about the person, and without becoming too cringy, as young people now say. I would type in like this: he's a master in asking right to the core when unraveling science. And right to the core, I mean, Marcus always tries to ask the right questions, not just in science, but also in what to do with the science. And I once was involved when the both of us in a workshop where we were supposed to give a lecture about how to do science and how to publish it. Marcus calls this science business, has a very long collection of slides. I think it might be over 400 if I'm right. The set that I got then was a selection, 137 more or less, and I just checked yesterday, 67 of them are about integrity in publishing. And I think that types Marcus very strongly, that is very much concerned and very much aware of the importance of, especially for upcoming researchers, to remain integrity. We all have a high pressure to publish, and it's very important that people like Marcus keep pushing the importance of there's something like integrity in research that we should safeguard and be aware of. So, and he also likes long titles, like this one that he will soon present. I leave it up to him soon to read it for you and to explain it for you. This is a long title, but of course, nutrition science is a long and winding road. As you can see, we're always busy with winding things, but also a lot of exciting things. And therefore, I'm very proud to announce Marcus Klaus to the floor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Geert, very much for your kind words. Mr. Rumens, everyone in the audience, it's people on the internet. I'm very glad that I can be here. I'm very proud of it. Geert asked me if there's corrections I have to do, then I should do them right before I start with my own talk. And when we're talking about this science integrity thing, Geert was mentioning the H factor at the very beginning. And you know how you get to an H factor? You just cite yourself very often. That is not cheating, because in order to cite yourself often, you also have to publish a lot, because otherwise you can't cite yourself often. But the level of my H factor is where you get when you have a lot of self-citations. The really high H factors you only get if a lot of others cite you. So I just want to put this a bit into perspective. There was actually a publication on this a few years ago where the top cited 120,000 researchers of the world were listed, including their self-citation rate. And I made rank 4 of the University of Zurich of self-citers. That was a tough time. And the other thing that I might want to say before I start here is when Geert is talking about this whole events that happened during my career, one might say that a few years before that all started, I met Irene, that is my wife, and we've been together ever since, and we have 3 children, which is a little bit more important than everything that was up there. This is something I have to say, of course. I'm really glad that people from Geert's lab are here, and even former people from Geert's lab. I wouldn't even have recognized you, Jill, nearly. I think I've never seen you with full hair. I've only seen you in the working habit. So today is going to be philosophical, and it's about historical, and because it's historical, also psychological aspects of science, not so much about nutrition, but zoology in general. And it's about these different sections, and one thing that I'm obsessed with myself, and that's how you can tell a creationist from an evolutionist. And I do not think God has anything to do with that. It's something else, and we'll get to that point. We are trained to be objective scientists, but we have so many influence factors that stain our objectivity. And there are several of them that have, most of them have an historic component, because this is how we have been brought up, or this is how we have learned stuff ourselves. And I want to use this time that you have been given me to give a lot of examples. So the first thing would be about the words that we're using. And this is something I'm really obsessed with. So the first thing would be an example that I just want to talk through without any pictures about it. Imagine you detect an enzyme, and you want to find out what it does. And then you submit several different test substances to this enzyme, one of it by chance being starch, and you realize this enzyme is breaking down starch. And you think, wow, that must be an amylase. And you call it like that. And I don't know how you call it, like amylase 1, 2, 3, and you publish that. What will everyone who will work with that enzyme again think this enzyme is good for? People will think this is for breaking down amylase. But maybe it's not. Maybe this is just a side finding, and the enzyme will evolve for a completely different reason. But we so easily give labels in terms of words, and we determine how people that will follow after us think about these things. There's a lot of examples in zoo animal nutrition. There's one that I'm involved with right as we speak. We're doing a small study on where somebody quantified VDR, vitamin D receptors, which we have higher numbers in those animals that absorb more calcium, but it's in an animal species that we know does not respond to vitamin D in terms of calcium uptake. But still, these friggin' VDRs are increased, so the only solution is they must also respond to something else, not vitamin D, but they're called vitamin D receptor. The names that we give things are important. And from the zoo scene, there's a very nice historical incident that you could use. How do we call animals like that? Well, they belong to the carnivores. And how would you, carnivore, yeah, meat eater, what would you feed a carnivore? If it's a meat eater, the typical thing would be you feed it meat. And those of you who know a bit about nutrition know what happens then. Because there's something that's not contained in meat. There's no calcium in there. And you will develop metabolic bone disease. So actually, historically, the original animal model for rickets, for metabolic bone disease, were lions, kept at London Zoo a very, very long time ago. And people realized if we just feed them meat, then the young ones are born and have bending bones, etc. and then they start supplementing with calcium, etc. Do you think this would have happened if they wouldn't have been called carnivores but prey eaters? Would anyone have dared to feed meat to a prey eater? But it's a meat eater, and then you feed meat. But we can use the word carnivore also to philosophize a bit about the craziness of the science business at the moment, because how would you define a carnivore? You would maybe say intuitively, yeah, well, what's a freaking question? A carnivore is something that eats other animals. That's it. You know, there's other distinctions in the literature at the moment, especially coming from paleontology, where you have hypercarnivores. That's all those animals that eat more than 70% meat. I mean, if you just eat a buffalo or a zebra, that's more than 70% meat. Then everything is a hypercarnivore or what? That goes actually back there. They cite other papers, and you can go back and you feel people are using this word hypercarnivore. Why? What is happening here? It's because, yeah, you know, if you're dealing in paleontology with these things, you want cool words, something that's so special. So hypercarnivore is like a hype that existed. But how would you then say, well, what's the difference to something that eats only animals and is a normal carnivore? This becomes worse and worse because, for example, in an article about the panda, the red panda, Geert mentioned that they belong to the taxonomic group of carnivores, but they eat bamboo. So how do these people call the red panda a hypocarnivore? It's a herbivore. What's the point in using words like that? But it becomes even better, so you have publications on, for example, sauropods, and you know what they are? I mean, they eat plants. They are hyperherbivores. And actually other people are using those words. And you wonder, what about the normal things that just eat plants? Do we now have to call each single cow a hyperherbivore? And the real ridiculous part is when you check out, and this is recent stuff and in high-ranking journals about humans, and you can imagine what we humans are. We humans are hyper-omnivores. And again, you wonder, what's this about? And this is about something that happens in science. Language in science is being used, I would say, more and more for hypes, for creating attention, for being spectacular, but not so much about describing reality. There was a very nice study in a 2015 edition of the British Medical Journal where these authors actually assessed the historical use between 74 and 2014 of neutral words like animal blood, woman, human, kidney, or positive words like assuring, phenomenal, promising, remarkable. And what they find is the control words, they don't increase in the abstracts of these papers over time. But positive words, the use of positive words has increased in science tremendously over time. They actually give a breakdown of that. So you could see a catalog that inspiring has increased, or what is the steepest one is like robust. Everybody's using robust methods nowadays, not just a method. Or enormous. What's this about? It's just about self-praise. It's about generating attention. Younger co-authors that I have try to put stuff like this in there. I always try to get rid of words like that. Personally, I think language, the thing about science is that it describes reality in a precise way. And if we want to keep it that way, that science describes reality, then we have to make sure that the language we use is precise. I just want to make fun of it using one more example. I don't know whether you recognize it right away, that you have unprecedented energy that robustly equals unique m times the squarest of all c's. It's so stupid to use all these words, but people are doing it, as you have seen in abstracts all over. There's another thing, now we're moving away from words, and that is something I always experience when I show guts, digestive tracts, and you have something like the forestomach of a sloth, and then there's a tiny bulge somewhere, and you will always have a student who says, what's that bulge for? It's this thing, we always want to know what it's good for. We always assume there is a function. And the example I like to make fun of this is with this wonderful pictures of a whale shark and a baleen whale. And you see that they have different modes of propulsion. The shark has the propulsion fin that's vertical, goes like that. And the whale has the propulsion fin that's horizontal, works like that. Which is better? Why is the difference? Would you have some intuition? So typically I ask this then to a class of students, and they ask, sometimes somebody says something like, maybe it's a matter of speed. And then I say, you know, you have very fast fishes like the tuna and very fast whales like the dolphin, and you have slow ones in both groups as well. It can't be related to speed. Maybe it's about the direction of how these animals are moving mostly. And then you can say, you know what? You have these vertical hunters like the big white shark or the sperm whale, and you have the horizontal hunters like the baleen, the filter feeders. That's not it. But it's just, so to speak, contingency, another word for the chance history of evolution. Because where do these groups come from in terms of their phylogeny? So they're evidently different, though they live in the same environment. And the whale shark, like all the fish, belongs to the group of the tetrapods that when they want to move forward, they bend their spine sideways, like an S, like the typical way a crocodile would work, because the extremities are on the outside of the body, so if it wants to move like that, and you bend your spine that way. Mammals, however, whales derive from land terrestrial mammals. They have their extremities underneath their body, and when they want to move, they do the galloping thing, and it's a flexure in this direction of the spine, and they retain it when going to water. Basically, what we're seeing is two different solutions for exactly the same problem, and you can't say one is better or not. I use this as an example that we always want to know, well, is this better? Has this a different function? And very often, that might not be the case. Because we are looking for something like that, we also often want certain things to happen, certain things to be true. And one thing is this, we want rules. And I think a lot of people have already talked about the fact that when a rule is disproven, what most people remember is the rule, not the disproof. In terms of digestive tract anatomy, I like to use this example of Georges Cuvier, the famous French anatomist that basically was one of the founding fathers of comparative anatomy. And he had this principle of correlation of parts that reads as this long text where he basically said that if you know the skull of an animal, the animal's teeth, you realize they are like for a carnivore, you know that the digestive tract will be like a carnivore, that the extremities will be carnivore-like, because everything has to work together. And this is how he said he can reconstruct the feeding habits of fossil animals, for example. And it would go like, yeah, you have a skull like of a cat that is designed to catch and kill living prey, then you can be sure the digestive tract is a simple digestive tract like for a carnivore. And if you then use the other example, grinding teeth, like you need to grind down grass material, then you will have the complicated digestive tract of a herbivore with, in this case, a multi-compartmental stomach, long intestines, and even fermentation chamber in the back. And Geert had also already given one of the things away of this lecture. Then you have something like this: carnivore skull, carnivore canines, simple digestive tract. And what is the diet of this animal? It's bamboo, because this is the giant panda. And you could say, well, you know, we have reasons why we have this logo for the giant panda, because it's so unique, it's on the brink of extinction, doesn't seem to be a very fortuitous evolutionary or digestive strategy. So maybe it's just the exception that proves the rule and everything's fine, Georges Cuvier is still right. Then we have stuff like this. evidently teeth not designed to grind down plant material, so we would think maybe it's a herbivore. And then we look at the digestive tract, an enormous intestine, and a stomach that is compartmentalized with different stomach compartments. So what now? Do the parts really always match? This is an animal that eats fish. It's a dolphin. And all the whales have complicated, compartmentalized stomachs, even though they are carnivores. And it's a lot of whale species that exists. They're not the exception that proves the rule. They are the many, many species that disprove the rule. So you can actually do this in terms of stats. This is something we did in more recent times. So this is from the PhD of Maho Duk Korea. So we check large intestine length in mammals and check whether there's a difference between herbivores and faunivores. We like to call them faunivores so that nobody thinks they're meat eaters, but they are animal eaters. And because we somehow find this pattern that the faunivores, the animal eaters, have shorter large intestines for their body mass than the herbivores. So yes, it's like the pattern that Cuvier reported, but actually there are no whales in this data set because this kind of data doesn't exist for cetaceans for the whales. But if we don't have them, then yeah, we get the pattern. You do the same things in the reptiles, and there's no significant difference between herbivores, omnivores, faunivores. You do the same thing in the birds, and again, there's no difference between birds that eat other animals or birds that are herbivorous. So if we would have to sum this up, we would say, yeah, well, in one clade we have this relationship between diet and gut anatomy, but in two others we don't. And here we only have it because we excluded the whales. But how are you going to remember this? Will you go home and say, you know, diet and digestive tract, they are related? Or will you say, yeah, actually, when people look at a lot of things, there's no rule there. What's the fun of having no rule? Apart from this craving for the rules, we also have very strange starting points of where we start our investigations sometimes. And I like to use the example of coprophagy for this. There is one very old publication that was the first one to describe coprophagy from a veterinarian in Paris, Monsieur Moreau, who describes the pelote stomacale, the balls that are in the stomachs of rabbits. He was a rabbit breeder, he ate a lot of rabbits, and he looked in the stomachs when he dissected them, and he wanted to know what is this thing that is in the stomach so often. And this is a more than 100-page, well, they didn't do papers at the time, it's a booklet, so to speak, and it's wonderful to read if you can do French. It's an amazing example of science by someone who was not at a university. He was a private veterinarian writing this book. He set out remembering that in the Bible it says that the rabbit is a ruminant. So he was thinking maybe these balls have something to do with rumination. Nobody has described that yet, but he was going to investigate this thoroughly. And he did a lot of different experiments on this. And in the end, he came to the conclusion, nah, they don't ruminate. They eat a certain part of their own feces. And one of the fascinating part of reading this is that he then describes how the university reacted. They didn't believe him. And then two university professors repeated the experiments, found the same thing, said, oh yeah, he's right. And then the university said, yeah, you know, this is something we already knew a long time ago. So he ends with, how could they not believe something that I produced that they already knew a long time ago? But it's a fascinating on the part of how good science can be done by a private person. But there's a philosophical question related to coprophagy, and that is, who does it? How do you determine the animals that do coprophagy? How would you set the catalog? You could say, I think animals don't do that, except those in which I find evidence that they do, like the rabbit, like, what is the next one that we have? Let's say something like the guinea pig. Or You could also come from the other side. You could say all the lagomorphs, the group of rabbits and hares, do it. All the rodents that belong to these two groups do it. They all have the anatomical prerequisites, and we only say those don't do it where we prove they don't. It's two different starting points. Which one would you choose? I think the coprophagy is so nice because you can find these examples that in 1931, a paper on nutria. This is, I don't know the Dutch name of this. It's a larger rodent, Sumpfbiber in German, it's a nutria. And this paper says sometimes they see them eating feces, but it's something pathological and it must be wrong. Then you have in 1954, a German publication on nutria, and they say with security we can say they don't do it. They don't do coprophagy. Then you have an Englishman, Maurice Gosling, in 1979, who just observed a lot of nutrias in the wild, and he observes a behavior where they bend over to their own anus and are doing something there, which is exactly the posture where we know that rabbits eat their own feces or guinea pigs eat their own feces. He called it refection, and he said, somehow nobody has noticed this, but I see this all the time when I observe them in the wild. So I think, yeah, they do coprophagy. And then, in the late 1990s, Japanese research groups actually used the nutria as model animals to study several different aspects of coprophagy. For example, when it happens across the day, how much it represents of their daily food intake, or what happens if they manipulate certain structures of the digestive tract surgically, what does that have a kind of influence? So you could say, historically, in nutria, people say, no, they don't do it. And in the end, this becomes a model animal for the thing. And you have the same in paca, another rodent from South America. The person that worked with me said this was the most expensive meat on the world because they're supposed to have super meat, so they are farmed also for meat. In the 70s, definitely they don't do it. Then there's a paper saying, oh, very rarely they do it. Then comes a paper that says, actually they do it regularly, and then we used it as a model animal to do detailed studies on coprophagy. You have similar things in the capybara, where there's a review on coprophagy saying a lot of rodents do it, but the capybara doesn't, and the author has to correct himself 1 year later because, you know, they do it. Or you have the same thing in the gerbils, where people say it's not normal if they do it, and now we know they all do it. Why start here? It would make sense to start here. At least that's what history has shown so far. I am not aware of a single species that have these, from the lagomorphs, the cavimorphs, or the muroid rodents, in which anyone has demonstrated that they don't do it. But you can expand this. I mean, coprophagy is something, eating feces, you know, it's not a big thing in science. But what about no animal is capable of consciousness apart from those animals in which we prove it? And then you hear, they found now that orangutans recognize themselves in mirrors, and oh, another species that has consciousness. And then maybe, well, they showed it in ravens. By now, maybe they also show it in crows, that they can solve different tasks. And we produce a catalog, another species in which this was shown. Why not start saying there's enough evidence that all non-human animals have the prerequisites to have consciousness? Actually, this is literally from the Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness that was made in 2012, where scientists convened and said, you know, you should assume all animals have consciousness. It's a question of where you start. And if you think they don't, just go and prove that one species doesn't have it. And then you can tick it off the list. It's a philosophical question where you start. And this goes in different things, like this is a traditional way of raising calves. I don't know, it always feels like a gulag or something when you see this a lot next to each other, these individually confined calves. And there's wonderful research by this research group of Mrs. von Keyserlingk showing how better calves develop if you keep them in groups, for example. And this is really wonderful research. This is an extremely interesting research group. But why would we have to show that social housing is good? Wouldn't it make much more sense to say those people who think this kind of husbandry is okay have to prove it is not bad? It's historical developments that drive how the research questions are asked. In our own field, when we go for zoo animals like the giraffe, you know, we take pains of showing that it's actually there's good effects if these animals are fed browse. Why do we have to do this? Anyone who wants to keep a giraffe without browse, they should have the burden of evidence to show that this is okay. The starting points we have are sometimes really strange in science. And sometimes it's also the end points. This is something I have nothing to do with, but I need to put it into lectures every now and then because maybe you all know this. My kids didn't learn this in school, and the politicians, at least in the country that I live in, you don't know this either. There's a very famous man who has produced work in England about the use of coal. At the time, people were concerned that, you know, we have all these steam engines and it's using all this coal, and will our coal be enough? And he found out it's Jevons. And the principle we're talking about is usually called Jevons paradox. He found that if people invented more efficient machines, it doesn't save coal. It means more coal is used because more and more and more people are using those more efficient machines. It's a typical thing that if you invent more efficient cars, it doesn't mean less petrol is used in the world. It means more and more people use cars. If you yourself buy a more efficient car, you might spend less petrol over the next year. But more efficient cars means more people can afford them and more will be used. Whenever there's a politician who says, well, to do something about the climate crisis, we need to increase our efficiency, this is not true. Empirical data from all different kinds of machinery shows if a machine becomes more efficient, the resource it uses will be used more on a global level because more people will use more of these individual machines. It's also a question not only where you start, but also where you stop thinking. Then, the last thing that I want to mention, this is my biggest obsession here, is this thing: we want things to be in order, we want things to be perfect. So when you are asked whether you are an evolutionist or a creationist, most people nowadays, or a lot of people nowadays, would say they're evolutionist, but you know really what that means. People who study evolution typically collect data, for example, like this. This is body mass in different mammals and gestation length, and we plot this data to find some law in this. So when you look at this very roughly, you might say, larger animals have longer gestation lengths if you don't analyze this data properly, because we all know that this is not true. We are vets, and you take a Shetland pony or a large draft horse, they have the same gestation length. You take a Chihuahua, or you take a Danish, what's the name? Like a big dog, same gestation length. Within species groups, like the two dots in the giraffe, or like the camelids, you don't see a lot of body mass dependence. You have all these bovid and cervid ruminants. Within a group, you don't have that. But people analyze these data and they say, you know, some animals are larger, some are smaller, they have different lifestyles, and there's all these trade-offs that means that every animal has a certain place in this data pattern. And the trade-off that people are talking about when they're talking about life history typically is something like this. You either invest more in reproduction, so you turn out a lot of offspring, and then you die early, or you invest more in your own maintenance, you live for a longer time, you produce less offspring every time you reproduce. And this is how we learn in biology, this concept of trade-offs. And I want to make fun of this and be really provocative. And now need you to think along. This is the last large example. Saying that you either invest more in reproduction or more in offspring is as stupid. This is as stupid as saying that with a given amount of fuel, you can either transport one person a long way or a huge amount of person a shorter way. It's as stupid as that. Question is, do you detect why it's stupid? We are bound to think in trade-offs. Because if you think this is correct, with a given amount of fuel, you either transport a certain load a certain distance or a higher load a shorter distance, you are ignoring the possibility that someone might invent a more efficient engine. This is what we have seen in cars. The old trade-offs don't apply anymore once a new thing has evolved. You could say the same thing once more. Saying this is as stupid as saying, if you want to have more meat on your chicken, you either have to feed it more food or for a longer period of time or both. And we know this is not true because somebody might just breed another chicken line that will grow faster with less food. That's evolution, that's possible. And we know that this has happened. The chicken breeds that were used 2005, starting already a little bit larger, grew much, much faster on less food than the chicken lines used a while earlier ago. Evolution can find solutions to trade-offs. So once more, saying that this is a trade-off situation is completely ignoring the possibility that evolution might have individuals or species that evolve a higher reproductive output without requiring more resources. This is what evolution does. It invents new things. There is actually evidence for that. So from the zoo population, this group wanted to show, okay, those animals that produce more young, most likely they die sooner. They found the opposite in this lemur species. Those that had more offspring also lived longer, because it's not a matter of trade-off, it's a matter of how fit the individuum is. And if individuals can do it, species can do it as well. Actually, if you have a species that becomes more efficient, will it mean that less resources will be used by that species? Nah. Mr. Janssens has showed us that will not happen. If a species evolves something that makes it more efficient, it means they start populating the world in bursts of radiations, for example, all the different ruminant species. If a species becomes more efficient than any other species, they might populate the world to the extent that you can actually see it from outer space, how this species is changing the world. So, having a trade-off is like saying you don't believe evolution can find no solutions. And this is where I come to my question. People think animals are somehow put on some graph, on some line. Some people will say, you know, they are there because God put them there. And if you like Genesis, you remember that God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. This is a perfect situation. And some other people say it's not the white man with the man with the long beard. They say it's evolution that put them there. It's like good old Darwin. And evolution put them in all their spots. And they are there because they are perfectly adapted, each of them, to their specific environment, to their trade-off solution. You can watch basically any TV program on an animal species, And I bet you within the first 15 minutes you will hear someone saying on the off text, and this animal is perfectly adapted to its environment. And it's the perfect that makes you a creationist. If you think something's perfect, it doesn't matter whether God did it or evolution did it. If you think there's perfection, you are a creationist. Because in evolution, nothing is perfect. It's just the next step. And it's just better for the solution than any other, better for the problem than any other solution that has so far been produced. It's not the agency. It's whether you believe in perfectionism. And we all want this. I mean, I'm putting David Attenborough here, Richard Attenborough here. He even had this BBC program where the name perfect was in there. So this is where people start analyzing data of animals. If you think about the body mass of cars and the energy they require, nobody would think of plotting everything that existed and then do a regression analysis across all this, because everybody would say, hey, you can't mix the very old models and the new models. You have to account for progress in this whole season, in this whole process. What about data like that? How can you analyze this as a fixed law, like because of trade-offs? This is just a snapshot in evolutionary time. There were times when you didn't have so many ruminants. You had much more elephant species of different body mass. There were times when you had lots of giraffe species and not so many bovids. This is not a natural law. This is just one snapshot of what has happening. And this brings me to my conclusion. If we think about something like this as something we can analyze in a really comparative way, thinking of trade-offs, everything's perfect, we might overlook really, really important questions. And I finish this talk with the question that is dearest to my heart, and I know I will not be able to answer it. It's a question you all know, at least those of you who are vets. And maybe you've heard me ask it already. I'm not sure whether you asked it yourself. The question is hidden in these two species that we know. Why does it take the horse 60 days more to develop, to grow something, same maturity stage, nearly the same body mass, same cognitive abilities? What explains this difference? Why are cattle faster doing this? And we know we've known these gestation times for ages. And I don't know whether anybody knows the secret in the difference in intrauterine growth. But it doesn't stop with cattle and horses. You know, you put dromedaries in there, same degree of maturation, same cognitive abilities. They need much longer. Okapi, this is a bovid ruminant, a giraffid ruminant, even longer. What causes these differences? If you would have to point, which of these four groups would you think should be most easily on the brink of extinction nowadays? Which should be going out? This here has a tiny spot in Zaire where it still lives in the wild. These rule the world, even without the domestics. These only occur in environments that are so sparse that other animals can't do much there. But we don't know the reason. How do they do it? What's the physiology behind that? And you have that question in so many different mammals. You have a hare, Hase, which reproduces a gestation length of a little bit more than 40 days. A hyrax, same body size, same amount of young, both have precocial young. Look how long the hyrax needs. There was a time before ruminants and before other animals went into Africa, when Africa was populated by hyraxes from very small to rhinoceros size. They're not there anymore. Now you have species that have a faster reproduction style. And you can do this, you can go on and go on for examples. A blue whale, it's not like twice the size of an elephant. It's much, much higher the size of an elephant. A blue whale can produce a young within 1 year. Elephant needs 2 years. There's not even a theory how they do this. And I would think this is one of the most fundamental characteristics. How fast can a mammal reproduce? And to make my philosophical point, I think because we're so used to think everything's perfectly aligned, we tend not to think in this competition comparative scenarios enough. So now you've listened to me and you've heard that I personally think that words cause a lot of preconceptions, using the example of meat eaters that are fed meat. We always want to know whether there's a functioning, like with the example of the differently orientated propelling flukes of the whale and the whale shark. We have quite selective perception because we rather listen to rules than to evidence that shows they don't exist. We start out with preconceptions without knowing why we have them, thinking we have to prove coprophagy, for example, in a lot of species. We have strange ending points sometimes. When we hear something's more efficient, we might think, oh, that's going to solve the problem. And because we think everything is perfectly adapted, we are not really evolutionists. Only when we understand there's no perfection, it's just the best solution at the time, a snapshot. That's when we really distinguish ourselves from creationists, and when we might be able to look at the really, really fascinating stuff, in terms of the questions at least. So that was the end of my talk. I thank you very much for your patience and listening, and thank you very much for the honor that you're giving me here.